Hey Year 12s, today we're discussing encountering conflict. If this isn't your context or you're not confident about what the task of context involves, stop. Go watch our videos on context in general or on your own context. There are 4 possible texts you could be studying for encountering conflict, each of which you'll find specific pages and videos for on here. But first you need to understand the big ideas of the context, which we will be discussing in this video. First, let's think about what does it mean to encounter conflict. When thinking about the wording of encountering conflict, it is important to discuss ideas in relation to the 2 parts, encountering and conflict. Firstly, conflict needs to be discussed and thought about as both a tangible and abstract concept. What is a conflict? What does it mean to have a conflict? What defines a conflict? And what happens during and after a conflict? You need to discuss an individual or group's contribution to conflict, how they encounter it. Is it through their own volition, or are they forced into being part of the conflict? Consider how humans initiate conflict and why, how we act when confronted with conflict, what conflict can tell us about a situation, and how we deal with the aftermath of a conflict. Can we live in a world without conflict? Are there always 2 sides to a conflict? Which generally succeeds, conflict or peace? Understanding conflict as relates to people and what it says about human nature can allow us to discuss how we encounter conflict. These are all big questions that we will discuss throughout this video. Keep in mind that context is not asking you to necessarily answer these questions, merely explore them in a deep and thoughtful way. Alright, let's talk about our first big idea, types of conflict. Generally, when we think about conflict, examples of physical conflict like fights or wars spring to mind. It is important to push away this initial reaction and think deeply about all the different types of conflict that occur. These different types of conflict can relate and influence each other. For example, an internal conflict can lead to an individual taking their feelings out on another, leading to an interpersonal conflict and perhaps a physical or verbal conflict. Conversely, a societal conflict, such as a war or political unease, can lead to tension between individuals or conflicting ideas in one person's mind. Let's talk through a few examples of these different types of conflict. There are obviously an endless number to choose from, but we're specifically going to talk about types of conflict that are complex and therefore make good examples in your writing. First up, internal conflict, the conflicts that happen within ourselves. Conflicts don't necessarily occur between 2 or more people. They can happen within a person. Internal conflict generally involves conflicting interests or thoughts within an individual. A person can believe in 2 conflicting thoughts at the same time. For example, I love my wife, and I'm angry at my wife for crashing my brand new Ford. These thoughts are different in how they would influence an individual to act. So what should this angry husband do? He could either respond by telling his wife that it's okay because he loves her, risking suggesting that the condition of his new car is acceptable, or express his anger and risk the deterioration of their marriage. Both responses have advantages and disadvantages, but there is no obvious right answer. Lacking an absolute answer or concrete knowledge of the situation can often lead individuals to have internal disputes over how or how not to act. This leads to a conflict of purpose and conscience. What will I do, or what is the right thing to do? Despite the similarity of these statements, they may have contradictory answers. As in the above example, internal conflicts may arise between a dispute of intellect and emotion or 2 different emotions. The husband wants to express his anger, but feels compassion for his wife. So which of the head or the heart wins out? Will external circumstances affect the outcome of this conflict, or will it depend on the personality of the individual, or both? Emotions such as regret are a form of internal conflict, that sensation of kicking oneself over a decision that was made previously. Imagine you are torn between attending a friend's birthday and studying for your SAC tomorrow. This external crisis can lead you to feelings of guilt or regret with either choice. In this way, external events can transform into an internal struggle. Alright, another type to consider. Interpersonal conflict, or a conflict that happens between 2 or more people. Just as internal conflict can develop from an individual's conflicting interests, conflict between 2 individuals can grow from them maintaining their conflicting interests. If two parties want different outcomes from a situation where only one can occur, there will either be a winner and a loser, where one party achieves what they wanted, or two losers, where the conflict has led to both parties losing something, perhaps through a compromise. This type of conflict can manifest itself in any number of ways. People may fight verbally or physically if their interpersonal conflict begins to heat up. The relationship between the people obviously has a huge influence on not only the conflict, but its resolution and consequences. Lastly, let's discuss conflict when it occurs on a much larger scale, societal conflict. These conflicts involve large groups of people motivated by sharing interests or beliefs. These types of conflicts could include cultural conflict, political or international conflict, examples war, generational conflict, religious conflict, or class conflict. Throughout history, these types of conflict have created significant change, such as anti-war movements and civil rights movements. In Australia right now, there are significant social conflicts over issues like LGBTIQ, that stands for lesbian, gay, bi, trans, intersex, and queer, which is the politically correct abbreviation when identifying individuals from that community. Rights such as same-sex marriage and treatment of asylum seekers. It is important to reflect that societal conflict, just like any other type of conflict, it is not necessarily bad. Sometimes societal conflicts can point out the unmet needs of minorities or the unjust oppression of individuals. Changes in the status quo to reflect emerging beliefs and values start with an individual or group challenging societal norms. In this way, societal conflicts have given rise to improvements such as universal suffrage and equal recognition of and rights for minorities. This leads on to our second big idea, how we as individuals interact with conflict. When considering this, it's important to understand the different stages of conflict. This means examining what causes conflict, how people respond to them, and how they are resolved, if at all. First up, causation. How does a conflict start and why? Any number of things can spark a conflict, whether it be a breakdown in communication, a power struggle, or fundamentally differing beliefs. Different emotions can also spark conflicts, such as fear, or intellectual conditions such as ignorance. Because of the breadth of ways that conflict can be sparked, it seems inevitable that individuals will encounter some form of conflict within their life, try as they might to avoid it. Second, what responses do involved parties have to the conflict? Individuals respond to conflict in all different ways. This is not only influenced by the type and nature of the conflict, but by the individual as well. Factors such as age, maturity, gender, past experiences, upbringing, and education level will all influence how a person chooses to respond to a conflict. On top of that, avoiding one type of conflict can sometimes lead to a different type in another area of life. For example, if one's only goal was to avoid conflict in their direct relationships, this could involve compromising a lot of one's own beliefs, which may lead to an internal conflict. On the other hand, if one always follows what they want to do and what they believe is right, they may end up doing the wrong thing in the eyes of another person, leading to an interpersonal conflict. The avoidance of conflict may instead simply be the transferring of one battle to a different arena. The one thing that can be said for sure is that the way individuals respond to conflict is personal, largely unpredictable, and often unexpected. How people respond might determine the consequences of that conflict for themselves and others. On a personal, interpersonal, and societal level, conflict can lead to drastic changes. These changes can be broken up into two categories: positive changes and negative changes. First, let's look at the positive changes. Going through a conflict can give a party experience in the matter, allowing them to recognize and sort through similar situations quicker and easier in the future. Further, when two people fight a battle together, their relationship may be strengthened through a greater understanding of the other person. Encountering conflict can also equip individuals with wisdom and maturity through enabling personal growth. If we see conflict as being a natural part of life, it must be considered that experiencing these clashes is a necessary part of growing up and finding our identities. Experiencing these difficult times may equip us with a resilience or persistent optimism to get through life. As discussed in relation to social conflicts, These experiences can often have positive outcomes for a large group of people. Women, the LGBTIQ community, and racial and religious minorities have all benefited from large-scale societal conflicts in the past. But what about negative changes? The negative consequences of conflict are the more obvious ones: destruction of cities after war, dissolution of relationships after fights, mental instability after internal struggles, and so forth. The aftermath of conflict can be wide-ranging and influential on the ability of groups and individuals to progress in its wake. Finally, we need to consider if and how the conflict reaches a resolution. Do not take for granted that all conflicts get resolved. Many are left without clear resolution. They are swept under the rug or continue to haunt those involved for years to come. Whether or not this happens often suggests something about the conflict and the individuals involved. When conflicts are resolved, this resolution can take place through a number of different means. Sometimes communication and compassion allow for individuals to resolve their differences. Other times, individuals must be willing to make compromises, such as relinquishing control over a disputed resource. Alternatively, the conflict can end when the thing being fought over disappears or the power structure in play is completely altered by the conflict. Progressive voices often suggest that the greatest tool for fighting conflict is education and awareness, because these are things that allow for ignorance to be dispelled. Our last big idea is that of roles in conflict. This idea centers around what type of position a person adopts during a time of conflict. As conflict seems to be an unavoidable part of life, it's important to understand the different roles that individuals play, defined by their relationship to the conflict. There are any number of roles that an individual can take on, but three major types include aggressor, victim, and bystander. It is important to recognize that these roles are complex and by no means static. A person may be motivated to become an aggressor after spending time as a victim, just as an aggressor may be made victim by a change in the power structure. So let's talk about these three major groups: aggressors, victims, and bystanders. The aggressor is the individual or group who initiates the conflict or prolongs it through their actions. Although the provoker is usually thought of as the party whose actions or failure to act brings about the conflict, there are also those who allow the aggressors to act. The initiators of conflict may instead be individuals who create a society or atmosphere in which groups cannot coexist. Consider a society built upon a corrupt government that allows too much power and not enough accountability to the military. One day there is a protest and the military uses physical violence to undermine the civilians. Although the military may be thought of as the aggressors, as they initiated the physical violence with the protesters, what role does the corrupt government play in this scenario? Perhaps they may be thought of as enablers who initiate the conflict by giving power to those who may become aggressive. Victims of conflict are those who are negatively affected by the actions of the aggressor. Generally, these individuals or groups lose something due to the conflict, be it a possession, power, dignity, freedom, reputation, relationships, their sense of identity, or even their lives. However, the line between aggressor and victim can often be a hazy one. Despite the stereotype represented in a lot of Disney films, there are often not purely good and purely bad individuals. Often there are wrongs committed on each side, and the individual or group that comes to be seen as the victims are simply the weaker of the two parties. So much of this is based on perception. If Germany had won World War II, we probably wouldn't have the same conceptualizations of perpetrators and victims that we do today. A bystander is someone who stands by the conflict and observes it as it occurs, while not taking an active part in the clash. This may be due to their initial lack of involvement in the issue or their active self-removal from the conflict. In either case, the theoretical idea of a bystander is often different to the practical version. Whereas, hypothetically, complete detachment from certain events or people may lead to complete removal from the situation, basic human emotions such as compassion and empathy can lead individuals to forego their bystander role. On the other hand, negative characteristics such as greed and pride can often lead to an individual to take part in conflict in order to benefit themselves. Alright, that's a lot of big ideas to think about. To help reinforce it, read the text on this page, which includes the information we've just talked through. Turn this into a set of notes for yourself and work to integrate your text knowledge into this information. Thanks for watching and happy writing!